the lions are. Wonder where 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 the lions are. Freight is on the knot on the surface of the bay. One of these days we're gonna.
So, hi everybody and welcome to the Where the Lions Are interviews. I'm Davide Falcone, also known as James Meadow, and tonight it's really a great honor to have with me from Nashville, Colin Linden. And it's quite hard to introduce you, Colin, because you're such a great singer-songwriter, but you're also a prolific producer and a member of the Blackie and Rodeo Kings, and sideman to the stars such as Bob Dylan, Bruce Cockburn, Emmylou Harris, and many others. You describe yourself as a genuine Renaissance man of roots music, and tonight...
I don't know if I'd call myself that.
Well, I read in your website, so it was a really kind expression.
A publicist did call me that. It's on the website.
Yeah, but...
I am a man, and I love playing music.
Yeah, okay, simpler. But
one day maybe there'll be a renaissance in what I do.
Well, anyway, you are our first lion in this episode. So welcome, Colin.
Good, great to be here.
Yeah, really thanks. I'm really honored. In the last episode of Where the Lions Are in the radio, I talked about Toronto and the late 60s music scene in Yorkville, something comparable to Greenwich Village in New York, I guess. Well, you moved back in Toronto in the early 70s, and you were only 11 years old, but you were already part of that of the local music scene. So I want to ask you, what are your memories of the time in the city?
Well, I came to Toronto. I was almost 11. I was 10 in November of 1970, and my family had split up. My folks had split up, and I moved back to Toronto, where I was born, with my mom. And my brothers came up a year later, and it was a much smaller city. I had lived in White Plains, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. And I was going to concerts every weekend at the Capitol Theater in Portchester, near where we lived. And I was totally into it. So for me, Toronto, going to the Riverboat and going to see shows at Massey Hall was a godsend for me. It made me feel, in retrospect, it made me feel like there was something to hang on to belong to. And with a little bit more retrospect, I realized that it was such a fantastic scene. It was the dawning of a really, truly, uniquely Canadian approach to music. And that approach had influence on music already, with the band and with Neil Young and with Gordon Lightfoot and with Joni Mitchell and others too. Those are the ones who immediately come to mind. Those are golden artists. And but it was sort of the dawning of something uniquely Canadian. And the Riverboat Coffee House and True North Records were so involved with kind of emblazing this original new Canadian music in my mind. And Bruce Cockburn and Murray McLaughlin really spoke to me in such a deep way. And the great thing was that in music at the time, and especially in Toronto, there was an acceptance of all kinds of roots music, of folk music and country music and blues, all of which was just part of pop music at the time. It was what you would hear on FM radio. Chum FM was playing. I remember one day, I used to sometimes record stuff from the radio if I heard something that I loved on Chum FM. And I remember one day hearing something from Stevie Wonder, Music of My Mind, which was new at the time. And then afterwards, they played Mississippi John Hurt, Coffee Blues. And to me, that world where those things exist was the world that I felt comfortable in. So it was a wonderful time. And I would say that in my mind, that lasted for about 10 years. And it was concurrent with Pierre Trudeau being the prime minister, and since just a sense of a freshness that was there. And it was a wonderful time, especially growing up.
Yeah. And in Toronto, you met the legendary bluesman Howlin Wolf and the Canadian David Wilcox. So I want to ask if you can tell us a little bit of those two encounters and the legacy of these two artists on you.
Well, both of them are in my heart every moment. With the Wolf, I had, obviously his music had permeated rock and roll music for, 15 years at that point, but I was familiar with Cream, who did Sitting on Top of the World and had done Spoonful. The Doors had done Backdoor Man. Jimi Hendrix had done Killin' Floor. All of these songs that were Howlin' Wolf songs. So when I finally heard the Wolf, I thought to myself, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. It made me feel like this is the real thing. This is what this stuff is supposed to sound like. And it seemed so much more serious and intense and just filled with a fire that just reached me. And that was around Labor Day of 1971. A friend of my brother's said, if you like this stuff, you should listen to Howlin' Wolf, and lent me the album, The Real Folk Blues. And it totally changed my life. That was the same fall that the London Howlin' Wolf Sessions album had come out, where the Wolf recorded with Eric Clapton and Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman and Steve Winwood and Mick Jagger. And it was connecting the dots so literally for me. And then later on that fall in November, the Wolf played at the Colonial Tavern in Toronto. And these guys, even though they were the giants of music, even then, they were also just working musicians. And Wolf did 6 nights and a matinee on Saturday. And I really wanted to go and see the Wolf. And the Colonial was licensed as a restaurant. It had a balcony, and the balcony was licensed as a restaurant, so minors could get in. So I begged my mom to take me to the matinee on the Saturday. And I just, I made calls in advance. Are you sure I can get in? I'm only 11, but I don't drink. I won't do it, and they were great. And the show started at 3:30 in the afternoon. And I was so concerned about making sure that I could get in that I asked my mom if we could go for 12:30. So we'd be there 3 hours early. And we got there, led ourselves upstairs. And then as soon as I got there, I saw the Wolf sitting in corner by the stage downstairs. And there was this long staircase that led to the stage. Wolf was sitting right there. He was just finishing lunch. And he was not going to go back to his hotel. He was just going to hang there until the matinee. And so I snuck down the stairs and walked up to him and said, Mr. Wolf, you're my hero. I'm only 11 and they won't let me downstairs, but would you come upstairs and talk with me? And he said, of course. So he came upstairs and I came upstairs, and we spent the rest of the afternoon hanging out. And I asked him questions, and he was he took it very seriously, and he treated me with such care and such respect, and that this was a young person he was passing something to. And he said to me, and I'm sure he was speaking of my generation, but he said, I'm an old man now. I'm not going to be around for that much longer. So it's up to you to carry this on. And he was talking about my generation, but to me, he was talking to me, only me. And I told him I would. And here I am now 50 years later.
And you did.
I'm the age he was when I met him. And from then on, whenever he would come to Toronto, he would always take time for me. And I got to hang out with him a lot. And it was a really special thing for me. And I think that we liked each other really a lot. And years after he passed, members of his band, and I remember calling his widow in the 90s at some point. I was playing with Bruce Cockburn actually on the road, and I had just been in Chicago, and I just called her up out of the blue, and she immediately remembered me, without any prompting, and so I felt like I got to know him, and he was very important to me. One of the things he said to me when I first met him was, if you want to learn this kind of music, listen to the people who I listen to. because they're the greatest ones. Like, he was very, very humble. I mean, he would be boastful and, on stage, not boastful, but he was out, really kind of, very much of an extrovert on the stage. But one-on-one, sorry about that. Let me turn that off. One-on-one, he was very humble about his own musicality, and he deferred to his heroes, who were Charlie Patton and Blind Lemon Jefferson and that whole generation. So he said to me, if you want to learn this stuff, listen to people I listen to. And so I made it my mission to discover those people. And I got deep into Charlie Patton. And through Charlie Patton, I learned about Sam Chapman. I learned that Sam was still alive. And out with him, I ended up staying with him in Mississippi and making his last record with him when I just turned 19. So I really dug in deep to the country blues. And around that time, when I was 14, it was actually, the date was July 14th, 1974. I was playing at a coffee house called Fiddler's Green in Toronto.
Yeah.
And a local rock and roll band decided they wanted to get up and do a folk set. And that group was called the Rhythm Rockets. And it had the greatest guitar player I had ever heard in my life. And his name was David Wilcox. And when I met him, I had never met anybody in my life who felt the same way about blues that I did. And he was so great to me, and he taught me so much, and we became close friends then. And I can say close friends to this day. I don't get to see him very often anymore, but he showed me a world of possibilities, and he was always encouraging, and he was very encouraging of the idea that you develop your own way of doing it.
Yeah.
And he pushed me in the right places. How to, if I wasn't, he was just great to me and always has been. And to me, laid out the groundwork for how to make your life play music and how to be a guitar player, how to dig into being a guitar player. And I admire his musicality and his playing to this day so very much. And I love him, and I'm always incredibly grateful that he was in my life. He was a huge part of my life.
Yeah, thank you for telling us everything.
I could talk a lot about those guys.
Thank you very much. Well, and then you were 11 years old at that time. Then came your first recording experience when you were just 15 years old, and you did your own version of They Are Red Hot by Robert Johnson at CBC Records. Well, you had never rehearsed the song before, so what were your fears and what was the pressure on a teenager to be on that stage and to be on that show?
Well, the thing was the show that we were on was called Touch the Earth. And it was the first time I had been on radio, and I played with a harmonica player named Doc McLean, who is also still a friend to this day, and a great musician and mentor of mine named Chris Whiteley played with us as well. It was my first time on national radio. Back then, CBC Radio was tremendously supportive of Canadian roots music, and it had a show called Touch the Earth that was hosted by Sylvia Tyson from Ian and Sylvia. And they had heard about me, and the producer was a guy named Paul Mills, and they asked me to come on and play. And we had rehearsed a number of songs, I guess maybe 5 songs or something. Every segment had an artist playing 4 or 5 songs, I think. And the material that I was playing in coffee houses, even at that point at 15, I was already playing some in bars and festivals. That stuff we played, but they wanted to, just for a sound check, said, what do you want to warm up with?
Yeah.
And I had never played the Red Hot before, and I didn't remember the words, but how hard could it be? And I mean, it's not like playing it like Robert Johnson, but we didn't really even talk about it. I just counted it in and we played, and everybody kind of knew what to do. Chris and Doc immediately knew how to fall in. And we weren't even thinking that they were going to use it on the radio. It was just for us warm up with. Maybe if I had known that it was going to be a recording that would be heard, I would have thought more about it. I probably would have wrecked it. But we just played it, so I wasn't really concerned about it. But everybody kind of liked it and said, "Hey, do you mind if we use that on the radio show?" I said, "No problem, of course." And it was kind of cool. And then they ended up releasing that as part of an album called "The Best to Touch the Earth." Yeah. So the recording has kind of lived on that way, but it was certainly not the intention that it was going to be that way,
Yeah. So talking about recording, I'd like to ask you about your debut album, because usually the first work of an artist is something from the studio, but yours is a live performance at Larry's Hideaway in Toronto. So how did you come to make this choice?
Well, a couple of things led me that way. The idea of doing a live album, or at least a live recording, was a seed that had kind of been planted. A few people, including the record company Ready Records, Angus Mackay and Andy Crosby were the two guys who ran the label, had approached me, said, "If you ever want to make a record, we'd like you to make a record." And I really wanted to make a record. I've always loved the idea of making records. I mean, every day I make records on one level or other. And it had been encouraged to me by a friend of mine who is an artist named Mendelssohn Joe, painter and musician, who I worked with and helped me out a lot back then. He said, "Why don't you just do a live album?" Because he thought that it would be something that we captured, something that was unencumbered by being self-conscious. So we were very, I thought it would be a good thing. And I was friendly with the guy who owned Comfort Sound truck, still does. And I still know him. He's still up in Toronto. Great guy and great engineer. And he was friendly enough with me that he said he would just do it and I could pay him when I had a chance to do it. So he brought out the truck, and his assistant, who was a real good musician too, who I knew, they set up the equipment and we recorded. And it just felt, even though it was filled with mistakes, it felt like there was some energy to it that was real. And I was quite inspired by the early, by the punk and early new wave music that was going on. It felt like it had a kind of a rawness and a lack of self-consciousness that reminded me of blues. And that scene seemed to be, it would embrace blues music too, and music that was influenced by blues. And so for me, it was kind of the last gasp of what the spirit of the real early Toronto scene was about. So we got it, I think. And, it's so rough. Oh, I mean, but I feel like it was the best, it was a good representation of what we're doing. And it was the best I could do at the time,
Yeah, we will listen on the radio to one song from the album. No, but it's amazing.
That's fine. I'm glad that it exists, and I hope people enjoy it.
So. Yeah. Moving on to the 80s, as you said, roots music in the 70s was inside pop music, but in the 80s, did you find it difficult to pursue your own project? Did you find difficult to carry on your ideas? Did you ever feel alone, out of context?
Yeah, I actually did. I felt really isolated for a lot of that decade. Certainly until around 1987. From about 1981 or 82, when people began saying to me, nobody's going to be playing guitar 3 years from now. You may as well learn how to play synthesizer. And everything that I had valued in music seemed to be not valued that much. And I continued to play. I kind of retreated to some degree to the coffee houses. And there was a sort of a scene on Queen Street in Toronto that would let me play once in a while, but I wasn't really the hippest guy there by a long shot. There were some bright lights that I looked up to. One of them being Bruce Cockburn, who continued to evolve and continued to be amazing through that era. But it was a difficult time. one of the great things, though, that came from it was I began getting more call, and to some degree pursuing, but to other levels, I just was so lucky and blessed that I began to get calls to be a sideman more. And that's when I began to do that. And one of the people who was a real life changer for me in that period of time was one of the truly greatest Canadian songwriters ever, I believe, a guy named Willie P. Bennett, who I had known Willie since I was a little kid at the coffee house scene in about 1973. Well, in November of 1973 is when I met him. And November 18th, 1973, actually, to be honest. And he was really good to me as a kid. And he was he was 9 years older than me and played with a generation of players who were, about that same amount of time older than me. And he really liked how I played, and he liked how I led a band. And in the fall of 1982, I was 22 years old. He had not played in Toronto in a number of years. He had moved away and kind of reluctantly came back to Ontario, and was approached by a club at a place called the Brunswick House. The club was called Albert's Hall, and it was the upstairs room at the Brunswick House at Brunswick and Bloor in Toronto. And it was a kind of a happening roots music place at the time. And they approached him about doing a week, and they wanted him to have a band, and they wanted him to use some of the established older players. And Willie said, I'll do it, but I want Colin Linden to be my band leader, and I want him to hire the band for it. And I was thrilled that he would do that. And that kind of really changed so much for me, because it put me in, for me playing with him, playing his music, I knew his early songs like I knew the back of my hand. So it felt so complete. My eldest brother, Jay, who's still a great singer-songwriter, he knew all of Willie's songs. He still knows songs that Willie never recorded that no one's ever heard. And we knew these songs in our family, that it was music we really loved. So I felt a deep connection to Willie, and that was, in a lot of ways, it still to this day, it changed my life. And Will was a he was a lifeline for me in that period of time. And we worked together. He passed away in 2008, and we didn't play together that much in the last 10 years, even maybe 15 years, but for the maybe 12 years before that, we played a lot together. And, I always considered myself his guitar player till the day he died. That was one of my jobs in life, was I was Willie P. Bennett's guitar player. And we laugh about that because sometimes a year would go by without us seeing each other. But I was still his guitar player. And occasionally he would get somebody else to play with him, but I was his guitar player.
Yeah. And then came the Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, and it's a tribute to Willie P. Bennett, right?
After 25 years of Blackie and the Rodeo Kings existing, we still are the world's one and only Willie P. Bennett tribute band. Yeah. That's such a big part of our lives, still. Yeah. And Willie played on our first couple albums. I think Willie never he didn't like being in the business. He loved playing music. So the idea that there were these guys out there playing his songs, he really liked it a lot. He thought that was great. And it was, we did it to honor him, and because we loved playing those songs. We got so much more out of it than, people say, oh, it's a great tribute. Well, we got way more out of it than still do to this day. Than we could have ever given. So, that's right.
Okay, so then again, speaking of important encounters you had in the title track of 1987, when the spirit comes, Rick Danko plays quite a big role. So that album, I imagine it was some kind of a turning point in your career.
It sure was. By that point, roots music had started to creep back into pop music. thanks to people like John Cougar Mellencamp, who made that record, This Lonesome Jubilee. I remember when I heard that and it had fiddle on it and accordion on it, I kind of thought, wow, this is a great step. And I thought it was a great record. That record and, Tom Petty and some other people who were more roots oriented were making really vital music. So that allowed the opportunity for me to get a record deal again. And I had made one record in between that I don't think had a lot of impact, but we got signed to A&M Records and we made When the Spirit Comes. In 1987, I was so really under the spell of the band. I'd always loved them kind of more than any other group that I had heard. And in 1985, October 29th, 1985, my band got to open for the band in Toronto. And those guys treated me like family from the first time that I met them. They were so great. And it was the 5-piece version of the band. Robbie Robertson had left, and Jimmy Weeder was playing guitar. Jimmy, who just texted me a minute ago, if you saw me reach over, still a great friend. I just produced his new album to this day. And those guys were wonderful to me. And when I was kind of getting ready I was writing the material for When the Spirit Comes, I was so inspired by them. And by the stroke of luck, divine providence, you might call it, I was in Edmonton playing the Edmonton Folk Festival, which was sort of a last minute thing for me. And Randy Newman was supposed to play. Randy Newman was sick and couldn't play. And they got Rick Danko to come and fill in for him. And we ended up on a workshop stage together. And I didn't know if he'd remember me or anything. But we ended up on a workshop stage together, and he was playing Mystery Train. And he saw me playing guitar. And he looked at me to play the solo on Mystery Train. And I played a solo on it. And then he looked over and pointed over at me and said, Toronto. And he totally remembered. And I had already gotten the deal with A&M, and we were getting ready to make When the Spirit Comes. And I was bashful about talking to him, but I said, Rick, do you ever play on other people's records? And he said, well, I'm not much of a session musician, really, but I always like helping out a friend. And he ended up on 5 songs on that album. And through Rick, we got Garth Hudson to play on a couple songs. And after we had gone to Woodstock, New York to record Garth, when Janice and I got back, my wife and I got back to Toronto, I had my answering machine, the old style answering machines. There was a message on the answering machine, and I listened to it, and it's, hey, Colin, it's Rick Danko here. Give me a call. And he just said that he really liked hanging out with me, and he said, you want to do some gigs sometime? And that led to my association with those guys. It led to getting to know Levon and getting to know Rick and Garth so much better, and getting to know Jimmy still, Jimmy Weeder. And, Rick sang on 13 songs on my albums over the years, and on a number of other things that I had produced. And we would do gigs together for a number of years usually in Toronto. I mean, he'd call me to come and play with him in upstate New York or in New England or someplace, if it was a convenient place to have a gig. But we would do gigs in Toronto, usually once a year. We'd have kind of Toronto and Ontario, and sometimes do some festivals together, and it was wonderful. So that was, it was such a shot in the arm for me and for my band, which, by the way, I had already, I had started playing with Gary Craig, who still plays drums with me today, and who plays on a bunch of the Bruce Cockburn records and a bunch of things that I played on, or that I've produced, and is one of my best friends. And he still plays with me. He started playing with me in '84. So throughout all that period of time with the band, Gary was playing drums already. So. Okay.
Thanks for sharing.
I can blab on quite a bit.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And I want to ask something more personal on your songwriting, if you want to answer. So, have you ever experienced a dry spell in your songwriting, and how you dealt with it?
I have, I guess. Sometimes I try to not be so conscious of that. Sometimes it's okay to let let it lie for a little bit until the ideas start coming by. But you do have to pursue it at a certain amount of time. And I say this reluctantly because I still think it's a mystery.
Yeah.
But I do think the more you write, the easier it is to keep going. One thing that I did find was co-writing, which I started to do. I got signed to Warner Chappell Music Publishing with When the Spirit Comes when I was 27. And the guy who signed me there in Toronto was really, his belief in me was really encouraging. And he didn't convince me, but he suggested, and I thought it was a great idea. It didn't take any convincing. He suggested that I come to Nashville and do some co-writing. He said, because he knew I loved country music, even though I don't really play, my stuff isn't like country strictly by any means. But he said, you might find some like-minded people. And he sent me on a trip down here to Nashville in actually just almost exactly this week. It was actually May the 6th, 1988. And it was just a couple weeks before Where the Spirit Comes came out. And I had this incredible week down here, and he set me up with different people to write with. And I wrote with 4 different songwriters over the course of the week. One song that got written that week ended up being a number 1 called Guitar Talk for an artist named Michelle Wright, country. Okay. And number 1 in Canada, but on a gold record here in America. And I found that kind of opening myself up for that helped the process. It seemed like it somehow kept the channels open. And I mean, that doesn't mean that, that in the last, 33 years, there haven't been times where I haven't written that much, or years that I haven't. But I try and stay engaged in songwriting every day if I can. And if the ideas come through, I'm just very fortunate for them. And I take them seriously. If I wake up, if something hits me in the middle of the night, I get up in the middle of the night and write, And I feel like in this past year, through the pandemic, I've done so much writing, and a lot of it has been remotely. My friend Tom Wilson from Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, he and I write together. We have something on the go almost all the time, and my wife is a really, really good songwriter, and she and I have written some of the best stuff I think we've ever written in this past year or two. So having some people to collaborate with helps you through that, I think.
We move on in the 90s now. That it's a really rich period for you, full of experiences. And I've always been curious how you managed to keep so many different projects all together. And for example, 1992, it seems to be emblematic to me because you were working with the band on their album Jericho, and at the same time you were working on your own blues album, the June Award-winning North at 9 and Saturday North at 9. Sorry. Yeah. So how did you manage to keep all these projects all together?
Well, really. A lot of things kind of interacted and intersected. In the summer of 1991, I had just returned from my first real experience in Europe, producing a blues artist there named Hans Tasink. And I had gotten back, and it was my last day of mixing. I was mixing in Woodstock, actually, and Rick Danko sang on the record. And it was my last day of mixing, and I was thinking to myself, what do I do now? What's going to happen? I've been busy for the last few months, and it's been wonderful. And I get a phone call, and I check my messages, and I get a message saying, "Hey, Colin, it's Bruce Cockburn. Give me a call." And I think, wow, maybe he wants to ask me about a guitar or something. And he asked me to join his band and help him put together a band. He had finished doing a record called Nothing But a Burning Light. And that was, if somebody talks about a moment that changes your life, getting that call was huge change. It's one of the greatest things that's ever happened. So we had the most wonderful time touring with Nothing But a Burning Light. Gary couldn't played drums on it because he was touring with Anne Murray. But our friend Mish Pulio played drums. But John Diamond, who still plays with me to this day, was playing bass, and Richard Bell, who had been playing with me for a couple of years at that point, who was the greatest musician I've ever met, and ended up playing keyboards, who also ended up being in the band for the last 9 years they played. So it was really one of the greatest experiences of my whole life touring with that.
Things were different before. Picture shifts to how it's going to be. Balance restored. When you know, even for a moment, that it's your time, then you can walk with the power of 1,000 generations.
With Bruce, for so many reasons. It was the first time I met Bone Burnett, who has been such a shining light to me, and of course with Bruce, who still also is. But we finished touring in the summer of 1992, the beginning of the summer. I had been approached about doing a blues album by a label in New England. A really nice guy ran it, and I kind of thought, this would be a fun thing to do. Ended up tracking the album with a remote recording situation, which was pretty early on into that. And we had a great time doing it. And I was really pleased with the results. So I brought the results up to a guy who I knew at A&R at Sony in Toronto named Richard Zuckerman. And he said, I'd like to release this album. Would you be a Sony artist? And I said, yes, it would be great. We'll put you on Columbia Records because you love Columbia Records. And I said, yes, I'll do that. So that was happening at the same time as the band had gotten a deal and had decided that they wanted to put together a sort of in between deals, really, but they wanted to put together, they wanted to record again. So Rick called me up and Levon called me up, and they said, we'd love you to be involved with this. Rick couldn't do a few weeks worth of gigs, and Levon had asked me if I would fill in for him on the vocals, and they'd get somebody else to play bass, and work on the record, in between the gigs. And I told him that I was working on my record. And I asked him, and I needed to record Richard Bell because Richard was playing with the band then. And of course, Rick was going to be on the album and Garth was going to be on the album. And Levon subsequently ended up being on the album too. But Levon and I made a deal that I would get to, because I'm an early riser, that I could work on my album until the band felt ready to get up and come to the studio and work on the album that became Jericho. And I would work with them on that. So we would spend the morning, an engineer would come in. I didn't know how to drive at the time. So I was at Levon's house, essentially stranded in a barn, that they have the shows at still to this day. And I would get up at about 10 and Richard Bell and Jimmy Weeder would pick me up. We'd have breakfast and then come back to the studio and work on South at 8 North at 9. And then the other guys in the band would kind of get up and get moving around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And then we'd start working on Jericho. So we did that for several weeks in a couple different periods of time, really about 4 or 5 weeks all told that summer, 2 or 3 weeks in one window and then 2 or 3 weeks in another. And those two projects are very closely aligned in my mind, in my heart.
I can only imagine because when I went into the studio, it was an amazing experience just for 3 days, but we were really close with my musician and my producer. We were really close and it was a magical experience. So I can understand the feeling maybe a little bit.
It's, to me, that it's absolutely a magical feeling, and it's why I want to make records all the time. And I began to produce records really around that time, a couple of years earlier, But I began to produce records in earnest just because I loved that experience that you're talking about so much. I didn't want to just do it once every 3 years or something. I wanted to do it all the time.
Yeah, and I completely understand. And I want to ask you because I read this book, Rumors of Glory, of the autobiography of Bruce Cockburn, and he says that T-Bone Burnett, he had a profound influence for also on the later album you produce, for example, The Charity of Night. So do you agree with him?
Oh yeah, well T-Bone, I became friends with T-Bone through playing with Bruce, because T-Bone at the time was married to Sam Phillips, and she opened the whole tour, or most of the tour. Certainly a bunch of the Canadian shows, but all of the American shows. And T-Bone often came on the road, and he and I became fast friends, still are to this day. And he was so encouraging to me and such an influence on me, just about how he would think about putting music together. Has such an incredible fascination in the chemistry between people making music, and has such incredible faith in the calling of making music and the honor of what it is to be a musician. And he brings that with him everywhere he goes. And for me, I felt like, in terms of being a record producer, there, you try and get as much knowledge as you can. You try and understand how to read a situation the best you can and learn about how things work. But I find it is more about spirit than it's about anything else. And using your imagination freely and not being self-conscious about what you think something is supposed to be like, and just use your instincts if you can, and your imagination, and have faith in all the people who are involved. And T-Bone really, really brings that with him as a producer. And that's, I try and keep that with me in whatever situation I'm in producing. And every time it's like having a lesson somehow or other, a reminder of that, because he's still, I can't imagine anyone being, he's so incredible. So.
And among the Cockburn albums you have produced, which one is your favorite, and which one is the one where you encounter the more difficulties?
Well, to be honest with you, all of them they've been really, everyone has been tremendous fun to do. Because first of all, I love Bruce and I love working with Bruce, but also by the time we get to the studio, he is so prepared. It's, to some degree, the biggest part of the job in the studio is pressing the red button, because he's so great. And he also has just a lot of faith and he's got great ideas, but he also will let himself, he'll be open to different ideas, and and he'll kind of know what resonates and what doesn't resonate as well with him. So he's so much fun to be in the studio with, and I just love spending time with him. That's the greatest part of it all. And I love all the records. Some of them I feel like just resonate to other people in a certain way. I mean, I have to say, Bone on Bone, for me, the songs are so beautiful, and the process was so great, and it was such a result of so many years of all of us working on it together. It was really Johnny and Gary and Bruce and we have a great chemistry, and my closest people, so we had a wonderful time getting to do that. So I love that. And on the newest one, which is just the instrumental record, Crowing Ignites, it exceeded our expectations so much. We thought that we were going to record a few new songs, a few new instrumentals, and do like Speechless, like the Speechless album, Volume 2, use a bunch of old tracks and as well, and kind of maybe remaster them and maybe in some cases remix them. We did that actually with one track on Crowing Ignites, was from Bone on Bone that didn't make the final cut, just because there was too much stuff. So that ended up on Crowing Ignites. But really, that exceeded all of our expectations. He wrote so much material, and we had a great time kind of developing it in the studio. We did that at a fire hall, a small old fire hall in San Francisco, and yeah, it was amazing. And then after that, a couple of weeks later, I guess, Bruce came to Nashville, and we finished the record here. And Janice, my wife, played on quite a bit of it, and was great, really great on it. And because she had played on Charity of Night and on Breakfast in New Orleans and on You've Never Seen Everything too, I think. So it was kind of nice. Bruce really wanted that kind of texture on the instrumental music. So we actually, it ended up being a really wonderful experience too. But all of them have moments. I mean, I think about Last Night of the World from Breakfast in New Orleans. And I think, that's Richard Bell, who was my best friend, Richard and Janice, my wife, and I play on that one, and Johnny and Gary and Bruce and me. And I mean, Rick Lazar played percussion on it, and Joe Dalmasser sang on it. And John Wynott recorded it. So I just kind of feel like that song, so many of the closest people in my life are on that song. And I hear everybody playing so beautifully on it. It's a pretty happy memory, I'll tell you.
If this were the last night of the world, what would I do? What would I do that was different? Unless it was champagne with you.
Yeah, and Cockburn in his book he says that Breakfast in New Orleans is among all these records is the one with the band sound because there was this kind of connection between you musicians. So I knew
it really felt like that.
Yeah.
It felt like that. Bruce was very. He'll get into something. He'll come up with a concept, and I will, on the records that we made, and his concept is usually very developed. So I'll just keep on throwing ideas out to, it's like he had the idea for Charity of Night of using Rob Wasserman and using Gary Burton. And we both thought that Gary Craig would be the perfect drummer on it. So that was Bruce's concept for the record, and everything else kind of grew from that. But it was a really sound concept to begin with, So
yeah,
it was great.
Yeah, and
he's prepared. He shows up with everything he's got all the time.
Yeah, I've seen on stage and I can understand because it's really magical when he come up on stage and he start playing on his guitar and singing. It's amazing.
It is. I've never.
Yeah.
I don't take that for granted one bit. I still love it so much.
But I think you mentioned Bone on Bone. I think in the Breakfast in New Orleans, I think there is some kind of your style of your sound in those two albums. Do you agree with me?
Well, I mean, we all kind of rub off on one another in terms of our influences and our sounds. He's certainly made a gigantic impact on me as a player and a writer, so much, and a singer and all that stuff. So he's in there all the time for me. And, we like a lot of the same stuff. So we have a lot of history together now, 30 years of history. So it's bound to be that way, that you, I think about Night Train on Charity of Night. We were getting the drum sounds, and Gary was playing pretty lightly with brushes, and John Wynott and I were in the control room, and we were putting a compressor on the overhead microphone. And when Gary played really lightly with the brushes, when he hit the cymbal, it sounded like it was exploding. And to me, it was the greatest sound I had ever heard. I loved it.
Fixing every shadow with its stare, night train.
and it changed how, just getting that sound changed how we made records. So those kind of experiences continue to happen, and the sounds that resonate with you, and the spirit that resonates with you, it does end up, it's not so much like you try and make the same record. In fact, you try to make a unique thing every time you make a record. You don't want to repeat yourself. You want to consciously go to a new place, but you also do have things that you love. You don't stop loving those things,
Yeah, and among the experience also as a sideman, I want to ask you the experience with Bob Dylan in 2013, because you played as a sideman to Bob Dylan for 11 days. So what kind of experience was that?
Well, the greatest band leader in the world, hands down. With no offense to anybody else I've worked with, he's got focus like nobody else. He's just, I've admired him my whole life, and I always wanted to play with him. And I made friends in that experience that are still great friends to this day. Everyone from the crew to the band and to Bob treated me beautifully. I loved it. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And the quality of musicianship of that band, and how heavy he is, not even just as the songwriter that everybody knows, but how heavy a musician and band leader he is. It was, I never worked with, Duke Ellington or Frank Sinatra or I never, worked with those people. And even the ones who I knew, like Wolf or Muddy Waters, I was never a member of a band of somebody like that. But I can only imagine that's the closest thing you get. And it was wonderful. It was an absolutely wonderful experience.
Thanks. And I wanted to ask you something from another thing from Canada, because you mentioned, and I mentioned in my last episode on the radio, obviously Gordon Lightfoot and the importance he had on the Toronto and the Canadian music scene in the 70s and 80s until now. So I want to ask you, I want to thank you for producing a beautiful tribute to Gordon Lightfoot in 2003. That is amazing. And I also want to ask you how important it was as a musician, as a songwriter, to set the stage for Canadian singer-songwriter to set some kind of path. I don't know.
I don't know if you can overstate the importance that he has had in defining or in reflecting the life of life in Canada. He is just his whole spirit captures something that you feel in the air there already. He's such a beautiful poet, and he gets that in his singing and his songs and his music. No, I admire him so much. And I don't think you can overstate his importance. I think it's been huge. It continues to be huge. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we are reaching the end of the interview, and I want to ask you something from Reaching Love, your last album with your own stuff in studio from 2015, and it sounds really fresh and authentic. In my opinion, contains some gems. One of them, for me, is I Need Water. For me, it's really a great song, and I want to ask you where the inspiration for the song come.
Well, my wife wrote. We wrote that together, but she was really the driving force behind that song. Initially, she had a lyric, and she's a wonderful fiction writer too. Her name is Janice Powers, but her fiction writing name is Curry Alexander Powers. So I often credit her as Janice Marion Curry Alexander Powers, because she's a person of such depth and gravitas. She has a lot of names. So she had come up with, she has a way of being very descriptive and very evocative of desolation and using kind of imagery from the world, from nature, and having it really describe what personal feelings could be without being as narrative. So she was really the driving force behind that. And as soon as I saw the lyric that the first verse, and I guess some of the chorus words, as soon as I saw them, I just had it in my mind how I felt like it would feel. And we worked on that for a little while. And then when it came time to come to the chorus, it felt like it just needed to lift up in a way that had a great release to it. And I remember as I was singing the lyrics for the first time, her saying, "Yes, keep going, keep going, keep going." So it was a great experience writing that song, and it felt very complete doing it. So glad you like it. I don't know if that explains it that well.
Yeah.
I can think of other parts of it that are really specific, but
no. This was my question.
I think that's a better way to
talk. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Good. And last but not least is a question about your future and Bruce Cockburn future, because last Sunday I've heard the Cockburn playing 4 new songs from San Francisco Lighthouse, and they're amazing, aren't they? Yeah, they were amazing, and I know from there that probably they will take place into a new record. So I hope it will be soon. But I also look forward to your own to a new record from your own. So what the future holds for you?
Regarding Bruce, he is. We've worked together. I've been producing all but one of his records for the last 25 years, and it's been wonderful. But also, I don't think it's ever sort of a given that I'm going to work on a record with him. And every time I get the call to do it, I'm overjoyed. And I would, anytime he wanted me to work on anything, I would do it. But also I understand that, it's, I may do it. If he wants me to do it, I'll do it. But, there's a lot of great people out there. So but most importantly, I'm thrilled to hear his songs because they're so good. I think, and where he's going is to a new place too. That's so relevant and so powerful. So it's great. Regarding me, a couple things. I have a new solo album coming out, which is different, I think, than any record. It's more of an electric blues album than any album I've ever made. It started by me recording some source material for a television show here a couple of years ago, a few years, and coming up with maybe 18 pieces of original music that was in a real electric blues style, which is something I do all the time, but haven't really recorded very much, certainly on my own records of. And after I had come up with these pieces, I thought to myself, maybe a dozen of them sounded like songs, even though they were just instrumentals. And I got a bunch of ideas for words. I knew it was going to take time because I knew I'd have to edit pieces together. So when the pandemic started, I thought, okay, well, this is something I want to devote myself to and find a way to finish it. So I came up with a bunch of lyrics and spent a few weeks editing, and 6 of the songs on the new album come from that. And then the other 5 are just recordings of new songs. Most of them have been made in captivity. And the title of the album is called Blow. And the title song, Janice and I wrote. And it's a hard hitting, I think, blues album. It's going to be released on September the 17th. The first, I guess it's not like a single anymore, but the first song that's coming out is coming out June 9th, and it's called 4 Cars. And then in July, they're going to put out another song, which is the title song called Blow. And then in August, a song called Till the Heat Leaves Town that I wrote with John Diamond and Gary Craig, all remotely, is going to be the third one. And then the record comes November 17th. And it's quite an honor for me because my friends Lucinda Williams and her husband, Tom Overby, started a label several years ago for Lucinda called Highway 20 Records that's distributed through 30 Tigers throughout the world, which is a great roots label. And I'm going to be the first artist besides Lucinda released on Highway 20. So the album's coming out on September 17th. It's called Blow.
Full of sinners who don't know their names, like flesh and bone, holds a human soul. You don't need to catch the wind, you just gotta let it blow. Like flesh and bone, holds a human soul. You don't need to catch the wind, you just gotta let it go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure. Okay, we'll see you.
We'll see you. Bye.
And I wonder where the lines are, 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 wonder where the lines are.